Good morning. Our ancient lesson today is from the book of Genesis, chapter 18 and chapter 22. The Lord appeared to Abraham in the oaks of Mamre while he sat at the entrance of his tent in the day's heat. He looked up and suddenly saw 3 men standing near him. As soon as he saw them, he ran from his tent entrance to greet them and bowed deeply. He said, "Sirs, if you would be so kind, don't just pass by your servant. Let a little water be brought, so you may wash your feet and refresh yourselves under the tree. Let me offer you a little bread, so you will feel stronger, and after that, you may leave your servant and go on your way, since you have visited your servant." They responded, "Fine, do just as you have said." So Abraham hurried to Sarah at his tent and said, "Hurry, knead these 3 sheaves of the finest flour and make some baked goods." Abraham ran to the cattle and took a healthy young calf and gave it to a young servant who prepared it quickly. Then Abraham took butter, milk, and the calf that had been prepared, put the food in front of them, and stood under the tree near them as they ate. They said to him, "Where is your wife Sarah?" He said, "Right there, right here, I'm in the tent." Then one of the men said, "I will definitely return to you about this time next year. Then your wife Sarah will have a son." Sarah was listening at the tent door behind him. Now Abraham and Sarah were both very old. Sarah was no longer menstruating, so Sarah laughed at herself, thinking, "I am no longer able to have children, and my husband is old." The Lord said to Abraham, "Why did Sarah laugh and say, 'Me give birth at my age? Is anything too difficult for the Lord? When I return to you about a year, this time next year, Sarah will have a son." Sarah lied, and she said, "I didn't laugh," because she was frightened. But he said, "No, you laughed." The Lord was attentive to Sarah, just as he had said, and the Lord carried out just what he had promised her. She became pregnant and gave birth to a son for Abraham when he was old, at the very time God had told him. Abraham named his son, the one Sarah bore, Isaac. Abraham circumcised his son Isaac when he was 8 days old, just as God had commanded him. Abraham was 100 years old when his son Isaac was born. Sarah said, "God has given me laughter. Everyone who hears it will laugh with me." She said, "Who could have told Abraham and Sarah to nurse sons? But now I've been given birth to a son when he was old." Here are spirit-filled words that invite us to wonder. Spirit, reveal yourself in them, and through words spoken here. Amen. When I hear this story of Abraham and Sarah and think about what God did for them, I not only believe that God is a miracle worker, I also believe that God has a sense of humor. God has a mighty sense of humor, and God laughs. God laughs at our silly notions and our sense of independence. God laughs at our lack of faith and our boldness as we try to venture out on our own. God laughs because God is a miracle worker, and we don't believe what God can do. When I read the story of the miracle birth of Isaac, I'm reminded of my own laughter when God called me into ministry. You see, God called me after I'd come out as a gay man and I'd left the church of my childhood, and I was no longer going to be a part of that denomination, a place that I grew up called the Church of the Brethren. I realized at that moment God was crafting miracles every day. Small miracles that brought encouragers into my life to nurture me and foster my call to ministry, even when I believed it wouldn't happen. Responding to God's call, I went to seminary, shaking my head, taking small steps in my education, and laughing at the idea that I would ever be ordained, especially in the Church of the Brethren. However, I look back and I see where God was working miracles to guide me and keep me moving forward on a path to ministry. I know that God laughed at my lack of faith and my unwillingness to believe. However, 20 years ago, God was crafting friendships that nurtured me. God introduced me to mentors that encouraged me. God deepened my faith and emboldened me to keep moving forward while I was laughing at the audacity that my ordination would ever happen. God opened windows that gave me hope. God opened doors that enabled me to catch a glimpse of God's vision for my future. Over those years of that journey, God performed miracles, both great and small. And while I laughed at the possibility of my ordination in the Church of the Brethren, I took steps forward. First it was a nervous laugh. As time went on and God was working these miracles, he put the right people in the right places at the right time, and the miracle of my ordination happened. A miracle happened, and I laughed. I laughed at my doubt. I laughed at my joy. I laughed out loud when I realized miracles happen. Today, I work as a chaplain at the Lutheran home in Arlington Heights. And I carry around me with a folder as I meet new patients in the rehab unit. It's much like a folder like this. And on the folder, I have the words written, "Miracles happen." The other day, a woman asked me what that meant. She saw it on my folder. And I said to her, "Miracles happen." I told her that I believe miracles happen every day. Great and small, they're happening all around us. We just need to keep our hearts and minds open to see God's amazing and unexpected miracles. If we don't, we'll miss them. Each of us may laugh at this idea. However, I believe that miracles happen. I still find myself laughing at the boldness of God's promises. However, I believe that God's work to do the unbelievable is present in our world today. We just need to watch for them. While I laugh like Sarah laughed at God, who is a miracle worker, I believe miracles happen. Amen.
Thank you, Pastor Matt. So what you'll probably notice over the next couple of months is something we're going to return again, which is a chance for folks to reflect on the scriptures before the preacher gets up and says a few words. So if you're interested in something like that, and again, the Spirit works, because I think that was a powerful word, a nice balance to the sermon I'll be doing today. Thank you, Matt. So this was an odd and I think very disjointed week for me as your minister and as one tasked to deliver the sermon. Now, of course, Douglas and I spent a lot of the week planning for a meal after church, celebrating my 50th birthday, as well as spending much of this weekend trying to figure out how to cook enough food for perhaps 40 or 50 guests. Some time ago, Douglas contacted 50 of my faraway friends all across the country to see if they would give me a call each for the next 50 days, one person per day, for my birthday. So it's been a gift in many ways to talk to so many of my friends that I have not talked to in years. He had a whole spreadsheet, right, to catch up with, that I had to, these people were assigned a certain day, and then each day he would ask if anybody had called, and for the most part, they did, which was kind of amazing, but he also had a lot of judgment when they didn't call, so that's, I don't know if he sent them texts and say, what happened? But it was good. It was good, very thoughtful. And so it's been a good month or so, and it's my birthday weekend, and surely I thought I need to keep it light this Sunday, right, when it comes to the sermon of all weekends. And then events happen, and the Spirit speaks, and what was spoken to me by the Spirit was something I find myself trying to avoid. But even I could not pretend that I wasn't meant, I think, to speak on this pressing issue. It was confirmed to me on Thursday when a clergy colleague, a friend of mine, not a UCC minister, but he contacted me and Pastor Jason from Ravenswood Church and asked if we could bring up this very topic to an upcoming gathering of the 47th Ward clergy. I told him I was amazed that we were thinking about the same thing, and surely this was the Spirit speaking to both of us. And that topic, that issue, that difficult word for this morning was around suicide. And the news that on Monday a young, talented minister died by suicide at the age of 30. Now, I have to admit that I had never heard of Jared Wilson until his death. But in more conservative evangelical circles, he was known for a really extraordinary thing, which was his forthrightness around struggling with crippling depression and his own struggle to resist death at his own hands. On Monday, he no longer could resist, leaving behind a wife and 2 very young children. Jared had been struggling with mental illness for many years, and though admitting to struggling with depression is difficult for any Christian minister, it is especially so in white evangelical culture, where to do so seems to be an admission that a personal relationship with Jesus can't take care of everything. To admit one's depression was to admit that despite being within a faith that offers hope, and that one's job as a minister is to at least partially offer that hope to others, there are times when one does not feel hopeful. In more moderate to liberal traditions, we have perhaps a more nuanced understanding of mental health, but even then, I don't know many ministers who would have the courage to admit to their congregations that they, who are supposed to supply the hope in their preaching and their teachings and their lived lives, that sometimes they indeed feel hopeless, that they sometimes wish to end it all. Some of it may be that they feel ashamed of their depression. Some of it may be that they actually fear losing their job as a minister, or eventually, in the end, losing their profession if such a thing was known. I mean, I can hear a church council debating, right? We can't have someone this emotionally fragile, this emotionally, spiritually fragile leading us. What does it say about us? And what does it even say about God? Even people within the congregation, even within more understanding ones like here at Epiphany, we struggle with the meaning of hopelessness when it is found within our ranks. You can imagine how brave it was for Jared to be so honest about his struggle in a part of Christianity where, frankly, depression is seen as a spiritual failure and not necessarily a mental health issue. I mean, how could anyone who knew Jesus in their heart find themselves so hopeless? And even in death, there were Christians in Jared's tradition on social media who were ready to assign him to hell, ready to doubt his faith in the first place and his trust in God. He had begun a ministry working with those struggling with depression and suicidal ideation, calling this ministry an anthem of hope. I mean, Jared knew that he was sailing into the wind, trying to convince people that Christians, faithful Christians, can struggle with mental health, with depression, with wanting to die by suicide. And such a struggle is not an act of faithlessness, is not a moral failure, is not a sin. On the last day of his life, he actually officiated at the funeral of a woman who had died by suicide. And he posted the following words on his Instagram feed. Loving Jesus doesn't always cure suicidal thoughts. Loving Jesus doesn't always cure PTSD. Loving Jesus doesn't always cure anxiety or depression. But that doesn't mean Jesus doesn't offer us companionship and comfort. He always does that. Sadly, it seems that when one person dies by suicide, there is a chance that others nearby will follow suit, causing a cascade of tragedy. Perhaps the funeral triggered in Jared something he couldn't challenge any longer, and the world is now less bright because of the loss of him to the other side of the veil. I don't know if you notice, but I use words around suicide here that are probably different than the ones that most of us use. I spoke of him as dying by suicide, and not the more familiar phrase, he committed suicide. I've noticed that change in phrasing the last couple of years, and I think it's a good one because I think the idea of committing something carries with it a sort of appropriation that we need to lay to rest. We speak of someone committing a sin, a crime, right? Or committing adultery. And such phrases carry with them, of course, a judgment, a kind of judgment that has hung over suicide in the church for centuries. For many generations, the Roman Catholic Church taught that to die by suicide was to commit a sin, not just an ordinary sin, but a mortal sin that endangered your soul and would eventually send you to hell. I encountered this toxic belief a decade or so ago in my previous parish in Michigan. I've shared this story before with you when a young Catholic high schooler died by suicide and the local Catholic priest would not officiate a service for him. His high school friends contacted me to see if I could help out, and they didn't want it to be held in a church, and I don't blame them because of what they had just experienced at the hands of the church. And so we held a small service with the students and some of the parents of the Watervliet High School on a cold and snowy evening underneath one of the light posts in the parking lot. This belief that dying by suicide condemns one to hell is not just a Roman Catholic phenomenon. You sometimes hear it among Protestants as well. Let me say that I cannot think of a more anti-Christian belief held by some Christians than this particular one, simply because of this. It impugns, it discards the mercy of God, the goodness of God, and the simple fact that God knows us, and God knows our pain and our joy, all that we are, and God knows of mental illness, of how humans can struggle, deeply struggle with despair, hopelessness. Ask Jesus on the cross when he screams, my God, why have you forsaken me?" I mean, Christ himself knows hopelessness. He knows despair. He knows what it means to quite literally lose all hope. And if there is one belief that I would ask you to challenge when it comes out of the mouth of some well-meaning but ignorant soul, it's that one. Refute it, reject it, say that it is wrong, and simply and frankly say that it impugns the mercy and the goodness of God. And then walk out of the room, because it is not a belief worth debating. How many times have I said that? It is not a belief worth debating. And yet, it would be wrong not to deal with the fact that some of us, many of us, are challenged by the reality of suicide, especially when it hits people of faith, people like us. Where is God in these moments? Why didn't God somehow and in some way prevent Jared from dying? Why wasn't the promise of God's very presence that Jared spoke so profoundly about in that social media post hours before his own death? Why wasn't it enough? We people of faith are promised many things, one of which is that God is with us even when we do not sense God's presence. Indeed, as I noted earlier, Jesus felt that God had abandoned him on the cross, though that was not the case. God was there. God is here. God is with us in our darkest moments. I believe that in the deepest part of my being. I have been there. I know that God was there even when God did not feel close. But I have to also admit that I have felt that, right? And I expect many of you have felt that way at different points in your own life. Sarah, the wife of Abraham, was certainly feeling that way, deeply skeptical about the promise made to her and her husband years earlier, right? About having a child that would be the beginning of a spiritual dynasty and a blessing to all the world. She had grown so frustrated by the promise not being fulfilled that she had arranged for a woman named Hagar to be with Abraham, so they could have a son, that she could take the son. It was not one of her better moments, to be sure. But Abraham and Sarah, if you look at their history, their story, they're really not role models in many ways. I mean, you're going to be honest and look at them, right? They're not. But that also shows us that God uses ordinary people to do extraordinary things, I think. The years had passed, and long gone was her ability to carry a child. Earlier, it must be noted, Abraham had received word that they would have a child together from another source. And he laughed earlier in the chapter before. He laughs at the ridiculousness. He literally falls to the floor in laughter. Now it's Sarah's time to roll her eyes and laugh at the absurdity of it all, overhearing these messengers from God saying that she would be with a child in a year. Whatever she must be thinking. A bit late for that to happen, don't you think, Yahweh? She lies about the laughter, perhaps out of fear, perhaps out of embarrassment, but I can't blame her for her skepticism. I mean, I've seen a lot, as many of you have, of course, and being a minister means that you often get ushered into the most intimate parts of people's lives. I was there for a woman who I did not pastor, who was not one of my charges, but who asked to speak to me about her son, who had walked into the woods behind his own home in his late 30s and ended his life with a gun. He had struggled with depression all of his life. He was a person living in constant misery, unable at times to even function, and his mother was a witness to it all. She found herself worried about where he was now, right? About his soul and whether or not what he had done to himself would damn him in God's eyes. No, not ever, I said. He's home. He's safe. He is loved, always loved. Before the Enlightenment and the Reformation, we in the West often used the specter of damnation as a way of preventing suicide. But the emotional and spiritual turmoil left behind because of those beliefs for those who grieved, it was immoral, it was wrong, and frankly, it was not true. Jared's wife, Julianne Wilson, wrote this on her blog post in memory of her husband the day after. This man who was the father of her two now very young children. No more pain, Jared. No more struggle. You are made complete, and you are finally free. Suicide doesn't get the last word. I won't let it, she writes. You always said, hope gets the last word. Jesus does. I certainly believe that, though obviously it must be said that when someone dies by suicide, the legacy of pain and grief for his or her family and friends and acquaintances is deep and it's long-lasting. Jared knew that. He knew that. He knew what he was about to leave in his wake. And it shows you how deeply he was struggling, that it wasn't enough to prevent him from taking his own life. God's mercy is great. God's goodness is deep. God's love for us is forever. And so I think he is at rest, at home, and at peace. But look, folks, the people left behind, the emotional and spiritual pain, that is just beginning for people who loved him. Jennifer Michael Hecht, the author of Stay, A History of Suicide and the Philosophies Against It, makes a sort of humanist case, a non-religious case against dying by suicide. And though when I was reading it, I don't always agree with her arguments, I did think she made a compelling case, even a non-religious case, to stay, right? To those contemplating suicide. That for 99% of us, things really do eventually get better if we will only press through the night, knowing that the dawn, that resurrection, will meet us in the morning. For us Christians who may be struggling with such issues as ones left behind after a suicide or as one struggling perhaps with our own deep depression, it's about believing God's promise that the impossible is possible, that miracles happen, right? That our cynicism, sometimes justified as it may be, may in fact be wrong, and in fact is likely to be wrong. Sarah and Abraham eventually get what they were promised, though it was not the way they had anticipated. And the timing, well, one can understand their frustration at it, right? They both laughed, and I don't blame them for it. However, God's words here, God seems to be angry here because she laughed. I mean, what would, of course, these messengers know of human frustration and heartaches, of course, right? They were angelic ones. The promise given to us by God that God is here and with us and that resurrection meets us on the other side of crucifixion, they are true promises, but sometimes they are hard to believe and sometimes they don't come to us as quickly as we think they should. All we can ask for those going through such incredible pain and hopelessness is that they would stay with us, as hard as it may be, as unending as the night may seem to them. And part of believing in God's promises is that when they, heartbreakingly enough, choose not to stay, God is still there with them. God's love for them is always there. God's presence with them goes with them everywhere, including during their journey back into the heart of God, which is where we all go eventually. Now, all of us are likely to find ourselves laughing with Sarah and with Abraham at some point in our lives, laughing at the absurdity of God's promises to us. But the truth of the matter is that the promises are true, right? Whether or not we can see them or feel them at any given moment. So stay with us. We must ask those struggling with the possibility of ending their life, stay with us until the dawn breaks and the stone is rolled away, so that you can know your own resurrection. Amen. Friends, join me in prayer. Gracious God, the God who is with us in the beginning and at the end and even beyond, we thank you for your faithfulness and we thank you for your promises and the fact that indeed miracles can happen. Light can dawn. The tomb can be rolled away. And we can rise, we who are people of resurrection. Be with us and be with all those that are struggling with dark nights of the soul. Help them. Help us so that they may stay with us. In Christ's name we pray. Amen.